Good morning, friends, and happy Friday to you. It is good to be back with you here today on the Daily Dose on the very first day of May, which is sort of hard to believe, but here we are. So welcome. Glad you're here. I want to spend some time this morning talking about threshold spaces. Threshold, as you might know, is a doorway or a space in between one thing and another. I learned a fancy word in seminary called liminality or liminal spaces. The word lemon, or that root of a word, not L-E-M-O-N lemon, but L-I-M-E-N lemon, is from the Latin word for doorway or threshold. And so liminal spaces are the ones between one thing and another, when you've left one way of being, but you haven't yet made it to the new way of being. When you're in between one stage of life and the next. I once heard liminal spaces described as like when you're in a boat and you have left the dock and you've made it so far out into the water that you can no longer see the dock behind you. And you know you're eventually going to land somewhere, but you can't yet see where you're going. And you're in this muddy middle where you can't see what's behind and you can't see what's in front. And it's a time of ambiguity and disorientation, and for some, a great deal of anxiety. And it's a threshold moment, a liminal space. We know these threshold moments. We live them. They are threaded throughout our days. The times between graduation from high school or college and finding a job, when you're preparing for one thing but you haven't yet arrived there. A time of being pregnant or preparing to have a new life in your midst, where you're beginning that process and you've left the dock, but you haven't yet arrived in the new place. Some of you, I know, are preparing to retire. So in that season where you know where you're headed, but you haven't yet arrived there, these types of liminal spaces are all throughout our living. I shared with our evening prayer call the other day about threshold spaces or liminal spaces, because I think we're in one right now. I think this time of quarantine and sheltering in place in the midst of a global pandemic is indeed a threshold moment where we have left one way of being and we have not yet arrived in the space where we will, at whatever point we will, and yet we are filled with ambiguity and anxiety, disorientation. It is a time of threshold, a doorway moment in our life. When I shared with folks on our evening prayer call the other night about this, I remembered an experience I had when I served as minister to young adults at Highland Baptist Church in Louisville, that wonderful, wonderful community. And I was responsible for people between the ages of 18 and 35-ish. As I got closer to 35, it became more 35-ish. But those are the people in our community that were most directly under my care. And in many ways, these years of young adulthood are one threshold moment upon another. They are just filled with these liminal spaces. One such threshold that became apparent over the years that I served in that role was that of a graduating high school senior preparing to transition from our youth group into our young adult group. My dear friend and colleague, Carol Harston, who was at the time the youth minister to youth and their families, and I had lots of conversations about this, because we realized that many of our graduating seniors who had grown up in our church, their families had been very active, would go off to college. They'd come home for fall break or Christmas break, and we'd see them that Sunday morning, not in the college Sunday school class, which would fit their new stage of life, but rather up in the youth room, back with their familiar setting, familiar rhythms and practices, and the familiar space of belonging and identity. And so we realized this transition from high school to college was one that didn't happen overnight, that wouldn't happen overnight, and yet would be a series of experiences of shifting from one space to the next. And so with that, we decided to host a retreat that we called the 12, 13, 14 retreat, like 12th graders, 13th and 14th grade. So we invited over Christmas break, toward the end of Christmas break one year, high school seniors, 12th graders, college freshmen, and college sophomores to come together to talk about this transition of youth to young adulthood. And it was so beautiful because there were so many moments where those who had come through the transition were able to speak about their time and talk about what was really scary and what was really hard and how they navigated through it and how they found courage and the capacity to keep moving forward. On that retreat, we had them do an exercise, and I'm modifying that because I want you to do it today as you're watching. So if you have a piece of paper close by or a journal or something to write on, I want you to grab that and spend a few moments in reflection. Now for you, you might find a quiet, perhaps you're like me and can barely find a quiet space in your home. You may have to escape outside for a little bit, but I would encourage you to find a quiet space. That could be outside. You could light a candle. You could sit with a cup of coffee or a tea or whatnot, and have a journal set before you. And I want you to imagine this particular threshold that we are in, this moment of global pandemic, this liminal space where we have left one way of being and we have not yet arrived to what life will look like on the other side. This moment that feels like one of such ambiguity and disorientation and fear and anxiety. And I want you to consider, as if you were a high school senior, a college freshman, a college sophomore, preparing for a transition, in the middle of a transition, and on the other side of it. I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. And so on your paper, you can draw columns and make 3 columns if you'd like, or just have 3 sections. And the first question I would ask you is, at the place you sit now, this moment, 6-7 weeks into quarantine, what do you notice or observe about yourself prior to March 13, where at least in Winston-Salem, that's where Mayor Joines issued a shelter-in-place edict for us? What do you notice about yourself pre-March 13? What were patterns of behavior you held? What were priorities that really mattered to you? What were some practices that filled your days? What were the emotions? What was the emotional state of being you found yourself in? What did life look like on that dock? I want you to take a few moments and do that. You can pause this if you need, but in the second prompt, the second column, I want you to wonder about this moment in which you find yourself. At the end of another week, what have you observed about yourself in the midst of this season of sheltering in place? When you are at home with limited scope of surroundings, what are some coping mechanisms you have found? What are practices that have filled your days? What is your emotional or spiritual state of being? What are some practices that have steadied you and encouraged you? Again, you can pause if you need more time. And then in the final column, I want you to wonder and look at those 2. Look at what life looked like before, what life looks like in the midst. I want you to imagine when we are able to return to some sense of normalcy, whatever that might look like. And I want you to write down, what is it from this time that you want to take with you into the next? What are some practices or priorities or rhythms that you have found that have mattered deeply to you, that you want to carry with you into the next 6 weeks or the next 6 months or 12 months or 18 months? When you reach the other dock, what do you want it to look like? One text that to me speaks of liminal space is one from the prophet Isaiah. We hear his call story, and I want to read this to you today. In the year that King Uzziah died, in the year, like a specific time, Isaiah saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their heads, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The pivot, this is a key line here. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard a voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. This text has always captivated my imagination, because I can imagine in that year that King Uzziah died, in that year that things were disorienting and ambiguous and a threshold betwixt and between, in this year of global pandemic, in that year, I find connections here, in that year, it was in the thresholds, in that threshold space where Isaiah heard a voice of the Lord and felt surrounded by the presence of God. When Isaiah heard God clearly invite him, who shall I send? In which he responds, here I am, send me. Richard Rohr, that great spiritual teacher and writer that we love, Richard Rohr once said this about liminal space. Liminal space, or the space of waiting, is a unique spiritual position where human beings hate to be, but where the biblical God is always leading them. It's where you have left the tried and true, but you've not yet been able to replace it with anything else. It's when you're finally out of the way. It's when you're between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. Friends, I would encourage you in this liminal space and these threshold moments in which we find ourselves to pay attention to how you're experiencing God, to what you're hearing, what you're seeing, to notice the practices that once filled your days and the ones that do now, and to wonder what might life look like on the other side. How might I be changed? Another of my favorites, this John O'Donohue book that I've shared a lot, To Bless the Space Between Us. John O'Donohue says this about transition and threshold. No threshold need be a threat. No threshold, not even this one, need be a threat, but rather an invitation and a promise. For whatever comes, the great sacrament of life will remain faithful to us, blessing us always with visible signs of invisible grace. We merely need to trust. That is my prayer for you this morning, friends, as you go about your weekend, that you might find space to trust, that whatever might emerge, God is with us, inviting us to transformation. Go in peace this day. Blessings on your Friday. We'll see you again soon.